Morning, Jason. Hey, Branson, how you doing?
I'm doing fine. How about yourself, sir?
Doing good. Jason, that was a nice article in Our State Magazine about your place.
Yeah, they did a real nice job with that.
Yeah, I just saw it yesterday. I thought that was pretty cool.
Yep. Yeah, we were excited about it. We did all the pictures and the article and stuff like in December and January. So it's been a long time waiting for it to come out.
Yeah, it's a pretty in-depth article, and I like the pictures. And it's a transition for a lot of people from the previous owners, and I thought you did a real good job of telling them, what was going to continue and what was going to be better. And I think that's really a great opportunity to to tell like it is.
Yep. Yeah, it was good. And it's gotten circulated a lot on LinkedIn and stuff. So yeah, so I think it's gotten in front of a lot of people.
That's great. Fantastic. So I'm not sure who owner is. Is that you, Bill? Not quite sure. But anyway, we're gonna pick up on the understanding category design today, and we're gonna start with one we finished on just to kind of reemphasize what it's talking about, and then when it's over, we'll talk a little bit about it. Let me share my screen. Okay.
Another way to think is to think different, not just better. If you're entering a space, a market space, with the idea of, well, okay, I see that company is doing this already, and we can go in there and just do it a little bit better, that's a way to have to claw for market share, not a way to like really blow it out as a category king. And so thinking about some things, you want to be seen as something that's different, not just better. And this has been going on, in history forever in business. And you're laughing. You had one of these? Your family? So this is the Chrysler minivan, right? The little background story on the Chrysler minivan. 1980s. And Chrysler was going bankrupt. This was the time when Japanese cars were on the rise and killing all the U.S. car makers. And Chrysler was suffering the worst. Its back was against the wall. And the leadership at Chrysler, Lee Iacocca was the CEO at the time, was looking at demographic information and realizing that all these baby boomers, the surge in the population, were having all these kids. So there was a big boom in families. And at the time, there were basically two choices if you had a bunch of kids. You could either buy a station wagon, which was just kind of a long car and didn't have as much room as maybe you'd need, or you could buy a regular big old van, which didn't fit in your garage because it was too tall. And so they said, well, can we design a car that's built for, families can hold 4 or 5 kids and fit in the garage and appeal to that particular market? And they came up with this thing called the minivan. Importantly, think about category, right? They created a category of minivan, not a product called the minivan. They created a product called the Plymouth Voyager and the Dodge Caravan, but they established in our minds that you have a family, man, you need a minivan. And then if you need a minivan, then the next thought is, well, who makes the minivan, or who invented this thing? Well, it's Plymouth and Dodge, and those are the people to go to. So this thing basically saved Chrysler in the 1980s. And it saved it by thinking differently from anybody else in the car market. And by the way, category king status is a long-term thing, because you think about the whole thing about biases in our brains. You establish that bias, and it's hard to take away. And it's, what is it, like 40 years later, and Chrysler still owns 50% of the global minivan market. And this was one of my favorites. This is our takeaway from a couple of our favorite Silicon Valley VCs who said their favorite kind of market is a $0 billion market. And a $0 billion market is a huge opportunity that only you can see. And you have to, and it takes a whole lot of faith and guts, because you have to be able to believe in it, even if others don't. And you have to be able to go and convince investors and convince customers that that thing actually exists. But if it's a $0 billion market, you don't have anybody else chasing you yet, because you're imagining this thing from the ground up. And so if you're not if you can't look and say, I'm creating a $0 billion market, you're probably on a path you need to think about. Here are a couple of $0 billion markets, by the way. I have a personal story about AWS. I think seem to be constantly circling back to Jeff Bezos, but as a journalist, I had interviewed him many times from the time they were a small company. And I was 2006. I was at a technology conference in San Francisco, wandering around the floor. I get a ring on my cell phone, and it's the PR person from Amazon who says, "Can you come up to suite whatever it was? And Jeff Bezos wants to talk to you." And of course, I said, "Great, I'll be there." And hopped in the elevator, went up, and so I see Bezos, and we sit down, and he says, "I want to tell you about something we're thinking of doing at Amazon." And he describes this whole thing about renting our computing power by the SIP. That was the term he used at the time. And this was a very strange concept. I mean, nobody had done anything like this. And so he's explaining all of this to me, and started stumbling over it for a long time, and he kind of finished, and I looked at him, and I said, well, so how are you ever gonna explain this to the public? And he said, "What do you think I called you up here for?" And he seriously was looking for me to write about it in a way that would help him figure out how to talk about it later. But I tell that story in part because he had no idea what AWS was going to become at the time. It was truly a $0 billion market at the time, and he just was throwing it against the wall to try to see if he could create this thing that had never existed before. And similarly, by the way, for this whole 5-hour energy, I mean, it's not just about technology, right? I mean, the guy who started 5-hour energy was wandering around a health food convention. He saw that there were all these energy drinks that were big cans of liquid, and they were being sold in the refrigerator next to Coke and Pepsi and all these other kinds of things. And he goes, well, he's walking around, he's going, well, okay, I'm tired, I need a boost, but I'm not thirsty, I don't want to drink all this stuff. There's got to be a better way. And he created the idea of the energy shot, and in fact, made sure that it was something that was shelf stable so that it didn't have to be sold in a refrigerator next to other drinks. He sold it by the cash register. So it looks like an entirely different category of product. It's not a drink, it's an energy shot. And 5-hour energy now is a $5 billion business. So, $0 billion market, think different, find what's missing. Now, if any of you haven't read this book, one of my favorite books ever about technology, Where Good Ideas Come From by Steven Johnson, who's a guy based here in New York. And Steven, he started with this, and he's a friend of mine, by the way, too, and he started the work on this book just with the idea that if you go back in time, back 100 years, 150 years, before there was a lot of communication around the world, great inventions tended to pop up in different parts of the world where nobody could have possibly known what everybody else was doing. The car was being developed in the US and Europe at the same time. The flight was being developed in the US and Europe at the same time by people who had no idea what the others were doing. Why is that possible? Why did those things pop up at the same time? And he started doing research, and he landed on this idea of the adjacent possible, which looks like this. So if you imagine, this is, on this axis over here is what technology can do. And so, down here is stuff that's proven, the television and radio, or those, I mean, obviously those things down here. And somewhere up here is stuff that we think technology can do someday. It's, you know, it's pie in the sky stuff. It's, you know, it's holograms and you know, crazy blockchain ideas are somewhere just a little beyond what technology can do. And along this axis down here is what society adopts and can accept. So, you know, in this part here are things that we readily use in our lives. We got email, we watch TV, all those things. And out here are things that we're not ready for. You know, you can introduce that product, but we're not quite ready for it. And you know, and imagine way out here somewhere is like basically science fiction. It's teleportation, sits out there. So Stephen Johnson's point about the adjacent possible is that all the great world-changing inventions tend to come in this thin line, just outside of what's already, what technology can provably do and what society provably wants to adopt, but not so far out that we don't quite get it yet, or not so far out that the technology is still sketchy. And what happens in this thin band right here is it's usually a combination of a bunch of things that exist already. So it's not, you know, and the minivan is a perfect example of that, right? It wasn't like this radical, like new bubbly invention of a car or a flying car or anything like that would sit way out here somewhere. But it wasn't just, let's take a Volkswagen van and put nicer seats in it. It was something that took a bunch of pieces that were already here and were already in here and just took it outside this line a little bit so that it seemed new and it seemed to solve a problem that didn't exist before, and it seemed to push the technology or the capabilities just a little bit, but not so far out that it seemed crazy. And that's important because, you know, I've seen, through my career, I've seen like probably 1,000 startups. I've sat with them, and I would say half of them are creating something that sits out here somewhere. That, you know, you go, and actually one of my co-authors for the book was Al Ramadan. And I first met Al in the 1990s because he started a company called Quokka Sports. And Quokka Sports had this idea of basically putting sports online and creating a new experience by adding a lot of data to, you know, what was flowing in, and being able to watch it on, you know, on the web. Everything about what Quokka Sports was doing was right. 10 years too soon, because we didn't have, you know, we still had dial-up modems. There was just, you know, and the way that people thought wasn't quite there yet. Like, I want to watch this stuff on my laptop, and so Quokka was a breakthrough company. Like NBC and other companies signed contracts with them. They thought it was really cool. But as soon as the tech crash started to happen in the early 2000s, it went out of business because it didn't have the kind of adoption here, and the technology couldn't quite do it yet. And so we see that all of the time. It just sat too far out here somewhere. So the great new categories are, in fact, just a little bit outside of what already exists. So just to walk you through a little bit about on the back end, what category design, what category thinking can actually do for companies. This was a company called Big Panda that's based out in Silicon Valley, and Big Panda was a very deep B2B business. It was basically making dashboards that data centers could use to correlate alerts that were coming in and sort them out. There's a bunch of other companies in the space. They were about 4 years old, venture-backed. And this is what their website looked like, and this is how they described what they do. It automatically correlate your alerts, which didn't separate them from anybody else that was doing the same thing and didn't sound all that exciting. But they had decent business in it, but they had some realization at the company that because we were correlating alerts, we had this enormous amount of data coming through our system. And they started to think, well, if we added we could throw that through some machine learning algorithms to start to understand more about what was going on, and maybe even start to automate the fixes to some degree just without having any humans having to touch it. They had all these big ideas, but they didn't quite know how to describe it, how to put it all together. So we worked with them and pulled it out of them, and they all started to, the concept and the missing spaces started to correlate. in their brains, and they ended up coming up with this idea of autonomous digital operations and a way to establish themselves as something that seemed different in the marketplace. And the analysts start to look at them differently, the marketplace starts to look at them differently. And it's a way to create, essentially, at the start, one of the things it creates is, at least it creates a conversation. They were able to go in and say, this is what we do. It's different from what everybody else is doing. Let's have a conversation about it and be able to tell you about it. And it's really, kind of giving them a whole new direction. Now, Sensity was the company that made LED lights. And they had this, this insight that Philips and GE and everybody else who's making LED lights had, which is that you've got a light and you can put some circuitry in there and some sensors and get some data and some information out of it, and maybe do things like connect and have a smarter home kind of situation. But they also realized that if you networked a lot of these things together, you could collect an enormous amount of data and analyze it, and the data would actually be more valuable than the lights. And so they came to this concept called light sensory networks, and really sold it more as a data play than a light bulb play. And went to like owners of malls, for instance, and said, if you put all our these bulbs in and connect them together, you could collect all this data about like the traffic going in and out, or air quality, anything else you wanted to understand about what was going on around your business. And that put them in a completely different bucket that made them look more like a tech company, a data company, a networking company. And about a year and a half later, what happened was they got bought not by GE or Philips at the valuation of a light bulb maker. They got bought by Verizon at a valuation of a technology company, of a data company, of a machine learning company. So the question is, when in a company's life cycle does it make sense to do this or think this way? And the question is, anytime. And I could cite all sorts of examples of any range of time frame. Now, yes, Airbnb, 5-Hour Energy, those were started by seeing a missing space, a category that could be created, and develop the product to that category. Big Panda, company that was 4 years old, already had done essentially what the company was started to do and got to a point of being stuck. Like, where do we take this next? And that's a good time to do it. We just worked with TaskRabbit. I'm sure many of you know TaskRabbit. And TaskRabbit was 10 years old and pretty successful in what it had been doing. But it realized that it had kind of stalled, it had done the same thing for 10 years, and knew that there was something still missing in the market, and a bigger and better way to do what they were doing and make it seem, and feel new again. And so that was, for them, that was a good time to do it. When IBM was 50 years old in 1964, when it introduced the System 360 computer, which was actually probably one of the greatest technology category, it basically created the category of the mainframe in 1964 by introducing this radical line of computers and junking its entire product line that it already had. It was 50 years old at the time. So companies can do this at any time in their history. It's just and some companies are great at doing it over and over again. Some companies do it from the beginning. Could be any time. Yes. But basically, the question was, can a startup do this? First of all, a couple answers. Just from our experience, from what we have seen, as we've talked to companies over, and about this whole idea of category design, fintech, healthcare, you name an industry that sounds difficult and established, it doesn't matter. There's new spaces, new opportunities in every single industry that's out there. I mean, we've seen it. We've seen companies come to us and have this experience. If you go into any established market and say, we're going to do essentially what they're already doing, but just a little bit better, then you're fighting the big guys. If you go into an established market with something that feels completely new and different, and as many of you, I'm sure, have seen, when you're fighting a big corporation, an established company, they can't move that fast. They can't do these things oftentimes. And so the startups actually take share away from them by doing the things that they can't do, that they can't figure out and can't manage to pull off right away. And as for a startup versus established company, yes, when an established company sees a new space, they can put all these resources behind it. But it's also really hard for them to do this kind of. Now, Chrysler, the minivan story happened because Chrysler's back was against the wall. They could take a chance on a $0 billion market. Ford and General Motors at the time had all the same demographic data, all the same capabilities, technology capabilities, manufacturing capabilities as Chrysler did at the time. They weren't willing to take a chance on something like that because they weren't desperate. And so what you often see with larger corporations, big companies, is that they're not willing to take those kinds of chances. They're more likely to try to incrementalize and just add, be a little bit better in some particular category that exists. And what we tell companies, and Mike is going to talk a little bit about this later, with something we call suit size. If you create a suit that's way too big for you and it's a brilliant category, what you're doing is you're doing somebody else a favor, because you're not going to be able to pull it off, and somebody else is going to see that and go, Google's going to say, we could do that. And so with this startup, we walk them back, and again, this is coming from them. It's us, helping pull it out of them. We're not telling them this, but walk them back to what can you do that's on the path towards that. Keep that big thing in your pocket for now, but try to establish some new category that takes you on a path to that bigger thing, and know that you're going to take it in steps as you grow and get the capabilities. But yeah, the suit size concept, and Mike will talk about that in this next session, is really important, because you can't, as a startup, do something that's so enormous that it's like trying to take over Google or something. It's not going to happen. So one of the basic principles, it all comes back to the idea that companies that design a category and convince people that that's a category that they establish in people's minds, and you're the king, you're in the best position to dominate it over time. And that's basically the concept of the book Play Bigger, and what we take companies through and try to work with them on. And so that's this first part of the presentation. And thank you very much.
Okay. So basically to me, the way I look at this whole idea of category design is just a way of thinking to put your product or service in the mind of the potential customer in a different place. Instead of being part of, you still be part of a bigger piece of your industry. But if you can start to craft a message and positioning so that you are different and you are unique in a particular category, or creating a category, I think you can see the advantage of doing that. Tomorrow, we're going to get into some practical application of this and how you can use these ideas, a little bit further along, rather than just somebody kind of explaining the concept broadly. So hopefully that will help all of us who are trying to figure out, well, how in the hell does category design apply to me? You're not a tech company. You're not trying to take on Microsoft or Google. I get all that. So we'll make a shot at that the next couple days. And hopefully it'll make some sense. The idea behind all of this really at this moment is to get you thinking about how you want to position yourself, particularly when we go to the live streaming, because part of the live streaming is you're basically creating a show of your brand and your product and services. So it's important to understand what you're trying to communicate, particularly as you go live. It's one thing to be on a website. It's one thing to be on email. It's another thing to actually engage with people, particularly people that you would like to become customers. And I realize that you have different products and services and different channels to sell those products and services. I understand that. But what we're trying to do here is orient you toward creating a unique space in the mind of your prospect and your customer. The words might be a little confusing, but that's our goal. We're trying to create that awareness and that, and people go, oh yeah, that's the people that do X, and plant that in people's minds, and it actually makes your life a lot easier over time as you get people understanding what it is you're trying to accomplish. Anybody have any questions or thoughts? Okay. Well, that's about it. I was going to start on the TikTok today, but this guy I met with is going to send me stuff. So we're not quite ready for that, but we will do that. And the other thing that I'm going to introduce, I'm going to work on the schedule here this week. I ran across a company called Clickly, and I don't know if any of you are aware of this. Klickly is their name. And it's founded by two women, and it's a traffic driving software that drives traffic to your website. But they don't charge up front. They only charge when you make sales, and they're wildly successful. I mean, it's unbelievable what they can do with this technology. So I am getting some information on that, and generally speaking, you have to be a bigger company before they'll really take time with you. But I have got them to agree that our companies, they're going to give me a special link so that our companies can give it a try. Absolutely no cost upfront at all. The only requirement is, though, that I must admit, is you have to have a Shopify site for it to work. So it's a Shopify app that works. So some may be excluded. They say in the next 6 months it's going to be wide open. So we'll learn about it. I was just blown away by some of their statistics and their numbers of what they've accomplished. And because to me, the hardest thing is getting people to come to your website and buy something. That's always a challenge and a very expensive proposition. So if they can drive a lot of traffic and it doesn't cost anything up front, sign me up. It's kind of my mentality. So, all right, everybody. Well, thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you tomorrow.
I had a quick question.
Oh, of course.
Oh, yeah. So do we ever have like a space on like this kind of a call where several of us are on and we could kind of brainstorm for each other, like a little round table?
Yes.
Because
Yes.
like I don't know Jason. I wasn't here the first morning. So and I just think there might be ways that we could support one another and not know it, or maybe even encourage one another. So
Yes.
Okay.
What I wanted to do, yes, it's a great idea. What I wanted to do is get a little bit of information out there so everybody is kind of oriented. So we're not, taking somebody who's brand new, who doesn't know anything, all the way up to someone who knows it cold, right? So
got it.
yes, we will do
Okay.
that. And we're going to have a couple of those kinds of opportunities coming up here.
Great.
So
That's great.
good suggestion.
Yeah. Thanks.